Hey there, and welcome back to the Beginner's Garden podcast. If you're new here, I am Jill. I'm so glad you're here. We are going to be talking all about the heat and how the heat affects our gardens and what we can do about it. I don't know about you, but when I was a beginning gardener, I was not prepared for the heat to have such an impact on my crops. Crops that I thought were summer crops and would do fine throughout the heat of the summer, like tomatoes. This was definitely a shock to me. I always thought, what am I doing wrong? Especially in the heat of a southern summer. Not all crops are going to love that temperature, but you're growing a summer garden, so what can you do? In today's episode, we are going to talk about when your garden might actually need a break from the sun and how to provide it with simple, effective shade strategies. Before we dive into talking about how to care for our summer garden in the heat, the truth is the fall garden will be here before you realize it, and I want to ask you something. Do you want a fall garden, but you just don't have the time or the energy to plan it all out? Well, if that's the case for you, the great news is that you don't have to. I am opening up a brand new fall garden concierge program designed for the gardener who wants a productive fall garden but doesn't want to stress over the details. I will meet with you over Zoom, get to know your garden space and your goals, and then I'll create a fully customized fall garden plan just for you. You'll know exactly what to plant, when to plant it, and where it all needs to go in your garden. Plus, you'll get a second Zoom session where I will walk you through your plan step by step, and I'll be available for email support all season long. Now, here's the catch. This is a beta round. I have never done this before. I have taught hundreds of people through my online course, Dream to Garden, but this is the first time I've ever offered one-on-one garden planning. And because of that, I am only opening this up to 10 people, and this will be for gardeners in zones 6 through 8. Once these 10 spots are gone, they're gone. So if this sounds like this is the support that you need, don't wait. I'm beginning my first Zoom sessions this week, and the sooner that we get together, the sooner that you'll have your fall garden plan in hand. Head to journeywithjill.net/planmygarden and grab your spot. Let me do the planning for you so you can enjoy your best fall garden ever without the overwhelm. But now we are still in July, so let's get back to talking about how to care for our summer crops. The first thing we're going to talk about is why your crops might need shade in the summer, which crops need it more, and which crops don't need it at all. But first, let's talk about how we know that our crops are suffering under heat stress. This will for sure depend on the crop, and as I talk about in a minute which crops are not going to need shade, you're probably not going to see this on any of them. But for the ones that do need shade, this is really where you want to keep an eye out. The first thing is wilting. This is very common in the heat, and honestly, it's common when your temperature first starts to warm up. Even in the 80s, I have noticed some of my summer-loving crops like zucchini, which typically can do fine throughout the whole summer, they start wilting, and it's not necessarily because that crop doesn't like the heat, but it's more because, oh wow, we just went from 60s and 70s to upper 80s within a week. They're not acclimated. Think about us as people. I was hot in 85-degree weather last month, but yet I know that my body would love 85 degrees in August, right? So we know how we get accustomed to the heat. The plants need that time to get accustomed to. So if you're seeing that wilting, especially the first sign of 80s, for instance, which you probably are going to be past this, but some of you won't be, know that that's normal, and a lot of times you really don't have to do anything about it except keep them watered. The wilting is the plant's defense mechanism to make it through the day. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to die. You just want to make sure that it's kept watered so that it can make it through. And especially if it's a crop that likes the heat, it will eventually adjust and it will be just fine. Another sign, and you may find this on tomatoes most frequently, but it also can happen with peppers some. I haven't seen it as much with peppers, But beans for sure, pole beans, I've seen this with, not so much bush beans, but that's just been my experience. And that is blossom drop. What blossom drop is you have the beautiful, in the case of the tomatoes, you have a beautiful yellow blossom. And of course, that's going to eventually form the tomato. But you notice that if you look at it, it almost looks like it's burned up, like it's dry and withered. And a lot of times when the blossom actually does dry up, that's normal and you can see the little tomato forming. But if you notice that all you see is that dry, withered, brown, leftover flower, then what happened there is that there just wasn't the right conditions for pollination. This is very common with humid areas. If you live in a drier area, I think you could handle heat a little bit more in regards to this pollination. But if you combine hot and humid, the pollen just gets sticky, it gets too hot, it's not going to be able to pollinate. And so what happens is the blossoms just drop. That's very discouraging, but it's very common. It's probably one of the most common questions I get from personal friends who will message me and they're like, I have a lot of flowers, but I don't have a lot of fruit. And I know we are in the 90s and this is what I tell them, like, hang in there, keep the plant watered. Eventually it'll be okay. But this is a sign that your plant is under stress. And it's a sign that you can add shade to maybe be able to get some more fruit out of that even in the height of the summer. Another thing that you're likely to see on peppers, tomatoes in particular, is Sunscald. Sunscald is basically what you see on the fruit, and it looks like a sunburn. It's this white like spot, not really a dot, but a white place on whatever side of the fruit is getting direct sun. Now, Sunscald is not pretty on your fruit. You definitely don't want it, but for the most part, it's not a problem. When you cut it, you can cut it out. But sometimes Sunscald, if it's left, especially in the case of peppers, it can start to kind of rot and that can spread. So that is a sign that those fruit are not being shaded well enough by its own leaves. This can be the case with tomatoes and peppers if you're dealing with disease and you're having to prune, or if a hornworm got out of control one day and you don't have the shade of the leaves naturally. Because if you notice with tomatoes, and I've got, tomatoes out right now, those tomatoes are generally growing below the canopy of the leaves, and that's to help prevent that. But some things happen. Maybe we got too aggressive with our pruning, and this is what happens, Sunscald. But that shows that these plants could use a little bit of shade to prevent that. And then you may notice slowed flower production, slowed fruit production. The slow flower production is something I notice in pole beans when it gets really hot. You'll just go out there and you see these beautiful plants, but there's no flowers. That's really just kind of a protection mechanism of the pole bean. And as long as you keep it watered, keep it productive, whenever the temperatures start to moderate a little bit, they will start producing blooms and beans profusely. I learned this the hard way, and I was like, what's wrong with my beans? And then turn September, I'm getting this huge harvest, which actually worked out really well because I had a ton of tomatoes coming on in July. So it was nice to have the beans, put off till a little bit later when I was growing pole beans. But this is what we'll notice is in the heat of the summer, you may just see that your plants aren't growing as fast and they're not growing the harvest that you need as quickly. So what is happening to produce this? Physiologically, what's happening with the plant? Well, plants will close their stomata, which is kind of like their pores, if you equate it to our skin, to conserve water. This keeps the water in the plant so that it doesn't lose too much water. But when it closes the stomata, this is going to slow growth. And because of this, photosynthesis drops off. Usually when we get about 90 to 95 degrees for a lot of crops, that's when this really slows down. So photosynthesis slows down, growth slows down. And then prolonged sun exposure, depending on the plant, can cause some damage to the fruit, like I mentioned, the Sunscald, but also even to the leaf tissue. So depending on how hot you get and depending on how much direct sun is on these plants during the middle of the summer, remember, the sun is at the highest point of the entire year here in the Northern Hemisphere on June 21st, 22nd. So, you're going to get the strongest rays of sun during that time, which I would say would be pretty much all of June and July is when the sun's rays are the strongest. So you're, especially with July and then moving into early August, you've got the hottest weather of the year coupled with the strongest sunlight of the year. That's going to be really hard for some of your crops. Now, here are the crops that are going to be most susceptible, and they will be the ones that are going to benefit most from the shade solutions that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. Number one would be leafy greens. Now, many of us are not able to grow a whole lot of leafy greens in the middle of the summer right now because it's just too hot. This is not the time of year that they shine. But I have been able to get away with growing arugula and mesclun greens like for baby lettuce, as long as I grow them and I cut them when they're little, like for baby greens, 3 to 4 inches. Yes, I have to plant a lot because I'm cutting them when they're young, but they're really tender and they're really good. That's the way I'm able to get salads throughout the summer. But I'm not going to get a big old head of lettuce or a big old head of romaine. Even many of my brassica blends that I really like that have like kale and mustards and pak choi and things like that. I have these blends that I really like. They bolt really fast, so I don't even try to grow them in the summer. But if you have a place in the shade, you may actually be able to get away with that. This is something I've been testing myself, I guess the last couple of summers, is starting some lettuce seeds indoors, then transplanting them in the shade, even in the summer. And as long as they stay in the shade and as long as they stay cool, I've actually been able to get more out of them than just the baby greens. So that's definitely something I'm playing around with. I've been able to see that planting in the shade has made a bigger difference for that. So that's allowing me to get a little bit more in my salad besides just arugula. Not that I don't love me a pure arugula salad, but it's kind of nice to have some of that more, I wouldn't say bland, but just more light tasting leafy greens with that. Other crops that benefit from the shade is if you are doing any kind of succession planting this time of year, those young seedlings or transplants definitely can use some shade to keep them from getting too much sun too quickly. I'll never forget one year in July, I planted a second planting of tomatoes, and they were Roma tomatoes. I planted them probably about 10 or 11 in the morning, and that was the worst decision because I just planted them in my garden in the middle of July. Even though they're tomatoes in their summer crops, I think I lost 2 of them because they just couldn't handle the heat. In retrospect, and in the future, I would put shade cloth for a little bit just to help them acclimate. And that allowed them to be able to acclimate to their surroundings during the middle of the summer, and they're better. So no matter what kind of transplant you're doing, whether it's a transplant of a lettuce that you're trying or something like a tomato, even a pepper, it may not need a shade as much, but especially if it's young, it might benefit from a little bit. And I would recommend doing this in the later part of the day, like almost close to sunset. Doing it at 10 or 11 in the morning was not my best decision ever. So keep in mind the time of day that you plant it. Other ones we mentioned before, tomatoes can use shade for sure. Peppers can. Like I said, most of the time for peppers, it's because of Sunscald. I have not really noticed a difference in production in the heat. I found peppers actually like the heat, but I'm in Arkansas. I have heard from people further down, maybe southern Texas, that they find that their peppers actually do a little bit better with a little bit of shade. So this will probably depend on where you're located, how much shade you might need to give your peppers. But tomatoes for sure, peppers maybe. Beans during flowering, I'm not sure how I would shade my pole beans. That may not even be a possibility, but I know some people I've talked to, I've seen they've got these big structures and they shade their entire garden. And so that may help your beans during flowering if you're growing pole beans. Like I said, I've really not had this issue as much with bush beans. They tend to produce okay. I do notice that I get a better harvest when they're harvesting early in the season or a little bit later. So bush beans may benefit from the shade as far as having a little bit better production, but I haven't really done a side-by-side test on that. So those are the ones that you really want to look at. Those are the ones that most people are finding issues with the heat of the day and of the sun. But there are some crops that you really don't need to shade. And I say that as an Arkansas gardener, zone 8A. So some of you guys who are in the South may think a little differently, but honestly, looking at this list, I don't know that I've ever heard of anyone needing to shade any of these. But I say this knowing that there might be an exception for the really far South. Number one would be okra. Okra loves heat. It loves sun. It thrives in hot conditions. It thrives in humid conditions. In fact, with okra, cool weather can stunt it more than heat ever will. So your problem with okra is it's going to be too cool, not too hot. Okra, that is my staple crop in the middle of the summer when everything else is suffering. I know I can depend on okra. That's probably why it's such a Southern staple. Number two is sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes have big leafy vines. They can take full sun, and the vines itself help shade the soil. So I have never had any issues with this. Sweet potatoes thrive in our heat. Don't ever worry about having to shade those. Number three is southern peas, such as cowpeas, black-eyed peas, purple hull peas. Those of you guys in the South know all of those terms. These are built for the heat. They're often used as cover crops in hot climates like ours, and they thrive in drought conditions, which is also usually what we're dealing with this time of year. But they're really good for poor, dry soils. This is a great time of year to grow these. They're definitely not going to need any kind of shade. They really want full sun. Hot peppers are another I wouldn't worry about shading. While some shade may help with the flower retention, most of the hot pepper variety like cayenne, jalapeno, they love full sun. Typically what I have found is that the hotter the pepper, and I don't grow a lot of really hot peppers, but the hotter the pepper, the more tolerant they are of heat. Whereas some of your bell peppers are going to be a little bit more finicky. That's just in my experience. Number five is eggplant. Eggplant is a tough, sun-loving crop. It thrives having consistent heat. It needs a lot of sun. I grew eggplant last year, and my best eggplant actually came from my green stalk that was south-facing. The plant was south-facing, and I had grown it in my raised bed, and I had one that was south-facing, but it was kind of underneath some tomatoes, and it didn't do as well at all. So eggplant for sure needs some sun. The next one would be melons, cantaloupe, and watermelon. They need long, hot summers and full sun to develop their sweet fruit. In fact, if these are shaded, this can hinder the ripening. It can hinder the growth. I've seen this time and time again in my garden. In my big garden, it's got more natural shade because I've got some pine trees around it. So it will get sun and then it'll get shade just depending on where the sun is tracking. But when I grow those same crops in my kitchen garden, which has no shade, they grow so much better and produce so much better. So keep those in full sun if you can. The next one would be loofah or other gourds. They do best with sun all day. Their massive vines love the heat. The next one is basil. Basil actually thrives in the heat. And while you may see it, what you think is bolting, it's actually not bolting. The regular process of basil is developing flowers that will eventually turn into seeds. And this is just the natural part of a basil's life cycle. It's not the heat necessarily, from what I understand, that causes that. That's just the way it goes. Now, it may accelerate in the heat, and that's fair enough. It could do that. But what you can do with basil is just pinch it. Instead of worrying about shading it, you can pinch it. Now, I have never shaded basil. Maybe if I shaded it, it would not flower as quickly. I'm not sure. Now that I think about it, maybe I should test that sometime. But in general, you're not going to need to shade basil. It's more important that you just keep it pruned. The next one, number 9, is corn. It needs full sun to mature. It needs as much sun as you can get it. I mean, think about the cornfields in the Midwest. They don't have any kind of shade. They don't need it. Corn, full sun. And then number 10, it's in the name, and that's sunflowers. Sunflowers are built for the sun. Literally, they follow the sun. If you watch them, their little faces follow wherever the sun is. That tells you that they love the sun. And they can also act as a living shade for other plants, but they don't need protection themselves. So most of the crops that we're actually growing in the summer don't need shade. If you look at that, my list was way longer for the ones that don't need shade compared to the ones that do. But the ones that do need shade, the ones that are going to be stressed, how do we know when to shade them? Well, for me, I would consider shading once temperatures are consistently 90 to 95 degrees. Also, it might be helpful to shade early in the season if you get a quick hot spell that is not normal for your climate. But in general, 90 to 95 degrees. Now, sometimes you may notice that tomatoes and peppers, sometimes, but mainly tomatoes, may start to abort their flowers over 85. So once it starts getting 85 and above, if you start noticing that your tomatoes aren't fruiting, then this may be the time to shade them. When you do shade them, and we're going to talk about shade cloth solutions after the break, but when you do shade them, aim for a peak time of about 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. This is when the sun's rays are the strongest. Morning sun is really good for these crops. They still need the sun to photosynthesize, but afternoon sun is often too intense for them, especially in the midday. Now, you may be saying, okay, I don't have time to go add the shade cloth at 11 a.m. and take it off at 4. I mean, I work from home and even I really wouldn't want to do that. So here, let me give you some options if you don't want to go put on and take off shade cloth all day long. So one thing that you can do is you can opt for a permanent structure. And I'm going to talk to you about that a little bit later. And the next thing you can do is add a shade cloth that is a little bit less percentage of shade. And again, we're going to talk about that next. But if a heat wave is coming, you may want to use it every day. But then when a cloudy day arrives, take that shade cloth off so that you can expose those plants to the sun. And it's basically already getting natural shade cloth on a cloudy day. So you may need to do it temporarily. Depending on where you're located, you may decide to do full season shade with some kind of a permanent structure. I know many people in the South do that. And right after the break, we are going to talk about how to provide shade, because I think that this is the question that a lot of people want to know. Yes, I know my crops may need shade, but I'm not quite sure how to make it work. Just taking a quick break to thank our sponsor, Organic Rev. By midsummer, the heat is cranking up and your plants are starting to feel it. The soil is drying out faster, the nutrients are getting used up, and the stress starts to show. That's why in the middle of the summer, often what I will do is I will turn to Organic Rev. I will mix 1 ounce per gallon of water, and as I'm watering my plants, I will do this instead. Depending on how hot it is and depending on how stressed my plants are, I may do this about once a week. Now, it isn't necessarily a quick fix, but it's a sustainable way to reboot the soil and to help the plants continue thriving, especially under stress. It helps the roots pull in more nutrients from tired soil, and it keeps plants green and photosynthesizing at full strength. Not only does it help with resilience to heat, but it also helps with plants' resilience to pests, drought, and other stress. When I see a plant start to struggle, especially in the middle of the summer, I will definitely choose Rev. I know it will support the root health, and overall, I have seen those plants rebound and do much better when I do this. For me, to try it out for yourself, you can go to organicrev.com and use my promo code Jill10 and you can get 10% off. This is a great option for you to help your plants even more during the heat of the summer. I've mentioned shade cloth. This is the solution that most of us turn to. It is the most practical. I wouldn't say it's super easy. It can actually be a little bit confusing. And the first part that can be confusing is how much shade do they need? You can get shade cloths in different coverages, 30%, 40%, 50%. And honestly, it wasn't until I started researching for this episode that I looked up the shade cloth that I've been using for many years, and it's 70%. I had no idea that mine was blocking so much light. And so it makes me want to honestly get like a 30% cloth to use so it's not more like an all or nothing type deal. But 30% is actually ideal for permanent structures. So many of the permanent structures that I have seen, and this is especially ideal if you work full time and you don't want to like on and off. And if you live in a more southern area where the shade is going to be more needed, then 30% would be a good idea for a permanent structure. You can attach shade cloth, whatever coverage that you use, to hoops, to PVC pipes, to T-posts, to floating frames. I honestly have not necessarily dove into this as much as I'd like to. I have seen a lot of people do some creative things with shade cloths, and I haven't done that yet. I need to, especially with my kitchen garden because it gets full sun. The reason I haven't done it so much in my big garden is, like I said, I've got some trees around, so that naturally provides the shade in the summer that those crops need, honestly, a little bit too much. But one thing I will do is I will use hoops that I use for like insect netting or floating row cover, and I'll use that for shade cloth. That's good for crops that are that are smaller, that are probably 3 feet tall or less. But I have yet to find a shade cloth solution for my tomatoes because my tomatoes are like 5 or 6 feet tall. And there are solutions out there. Just Google it, go to Pinterest. I'm sure there's lots of things. I just personally haven't done it yet. But with those being the plants that probably need it the most, I probably need to figure that out sooner than later, especially now that I'm growing them in my kitchen garden, which is in full sun. One thing to remember when you're putting the shade cloth on, though, is you want to avoid putting it directly on the plants, and you want to elevate them so that way there's enough airflow. That's a big mistake that I've made in the past, is not allowing enough airflow, because if you don't do that, that you're basically creating a greenhouse, and that's the last thing you want to do in the heat of the summer. Now, if you do use insect netting to help against pests, this can diffuse the sunlight just a little bit. I wouldn't necessarily call it shade cloth, but it may have a small amount of protection with it. But you could also use things you have around the house: old sheets, umbrellas, lattice panels, burlap. I've seen lots of those things. And in fact, there is a garden nearby that I drive by all the time. I think it's an old garden. They've had it for many years. And I just see like old sheets clipped on tomato cages. And they're smart. They've learned where to do it. They've done it on the southwest part of their garden, where their garden faces southwest, more west than south, but that's the side that they cover. So they allow the sun to get the tomatoes on the eastern side, but they put these white sheets on the tomato cages. Now, those sheets are probably touching the plant. I don't see how they couldn't, but that was an example of someone I've seen using very traditional gardening practices. They till their soil, they garden in rows, and you've got one row for each crop. Very traditional garden. You can tell they've been doing this for their lifetime, and that's what they did. They are putting probably what I would assume is old sheets on there, and obviously they work because they do it year after year. In this case, you can clip it. You can buy garden clips. I bought some clips off Amazon that are metal that are pretty good, but you can also get clamps, and you can clip these things to these structures. You can also use a trellis and just, use maybe a cattle panel trellis. I've seen a lot of people do this. Most people use that cattle panel arch trellis for vining crops, but instead you could just use it as a shade like arbor where you can put your shade cloth on top of it. You could also create movable structures. So you could create a structure that would fit over a raised bed that you put there temporarily and attach your shade cloth to that and then take it off when you don't need it. There's so many things you can do. You can get very creative with it depending on how good you are with engineering. I would say there's some engineering that goes along with this. This is probably why I haven't tackled it as much as I should have, because that is not my strong suit, and I hate having to figure out things like that. And I have also found that if I don't get my shade cloth anchored well, then you get a windstorm and it's all gone, or it blows on your plants and breaks the stems, and you got to really be careful with that. Another thing that you can do, especially if you're doing lettuces, for instance, or smaller plants, you can strategically plant them in the shade of a taller plant, such as sunflowers or corn, pole beans, or okra. I've had luck planting lettuce underneath okra before, and it's done really well. This is just to provide some extra shade for those plants that can need it. And then you can also strategically interplant to block afternoon sun. This is something I did in the spring, and I found it was really interesting. I planted some lettuce crops in different parts of my raised bed because of, as I always do, I overseeded and had too many lettuce plants. So I just started like, okay, there's a space here, there's a space here. That is really interesting because there was this one bed that I planted lettuce on the east side of tomatoes, and I planted another lettuce crop on the west side. And the west side is going to get the strongest sun. And that one actually started bolting before the one in the east. They had the same amount of shade, but it was the western sun that caused it to bolt. And then in another 2 beds, I planted lettuce, the same variety, in 2 beds. One of them happened to be, for some reason, shaded more by, I think it was the carrots, and it may have been the peppers too, but I'd planted it around carrots and peppers. But for some reason, those carrots were taller. But where they were shaded more by even those carrots nearby, they bolted much slower than the ones that were in full sun. So I've seen this, and as if you're a gardener that's been doing this for a while and you've been testing, you can see a shade really does make a difference especially with those greens. So keep in mind where the sun is, and if you're interplanting, where you can plant some of these crops to help to shade the crops that need it. And another thing that I like to do is, again, if I'm going to shade any direction, I would probably shade from the west and the south, and then I would leave the east and the north open for sunlight and for airflow. But you can test that, play with that, watch your crops, see if you can notice a difference, because not only will you learn something, but by watching it, you learn it better. Just watching the way that those lettuce plants behaved, I really saw what I had read and what I'd listened to, what I'd heard. I saw it with my eyes, and it makes such a bigger difference for me as a gardener when I am doing those things, and I can see it, and I learn it so much better that way. So as we wrap up here, I would love to hear from you. I know many of you have so much more experience with shading your crops, especially if you live in an area south of me. When I post this, I'd love to connect with you on Instagram. You can find me at The Beginner's Garden. And when I share about this particular podcast episode, send me a DM, comment on the post, whatever, and tell me what you have done in the past that has worked, or what you've done in the past that hasn't worked. And for those of you who are listening on Spotify, Spotify allows comments to podcast episodes. So comment on this Spotify episode and let me know some tips. I would love to hear them because, like I said, I'm kind of new at this because of my regular garden having natural shade, and now I'm having to really think about this in my kitchen garden. So I would love to get your advice and your thoughts on how to make this even better, and we can all learn from each other. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this is helpful, and I hope you're having a great July. I will chat with you again next Tuesday. Make sure you're subscribed so that episode drops in your podcast player, and I can't wait to talk to you then. Have a great day.